Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving deep into something we hear all the time, state and nation.
Yeah.
We use the terms almost interchangeably, but are they really the same thing?
Good question.
That's exactly what we're going to untangle today using this paper called The State and Nation.
Okay. Sounds interesting.
It's a fascinating read, and
Yeah.
it takes us down some paths I honestly wasn't expecting.
I'm intrigued.
So before we go any further, can you give us a little groundwork? What's the core difference between a state and a nation?
Sure. When we talk about state, think of it like the machinery of government,
Okay.
the bureaucratic structure that makes sure laws and customs are enforced within a specific territory.
So basically the ruling structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A nation, though, that's about the people. It's a group connected by a shared identity,
I see.
often rooted in things like common ancestry, culture, and beliefs.
Okay, so state is the system and nation is the people.
You got it. But here's the thing. While the state is supposed to work for the nation's interests,
Yeah.
this paper argues that's not always how it goes.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying the state and the nation can actually be at odds?
Sometimes, yeah.
How does that even work?
The author makes a pretty strong case that the state, with all its power and resources, can become, well, kind of self-serving.
Like it forgets about the people it's supposed to be serving.
Right. It gets so caught up in keeping its own power that it loses sight of the nation's well-being.
It's like that whole power corrupts thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so how does the author define what a nation even is?
Good question.
Seems like that's pretty key to understanding this whole power dynamic, you know?
Absolutely. They break it down into three parts: race, ethnicity, culture, and religion.
Okay.
Race ethnicity is seen as the foundation,
Okay.
the bedrock, you could say.
Got it.
Then culture emerges from that foundation, shaped by worldviews, values, the environment, all that.
And religion.
That's the most crucial part, according to the author. It shapes culture and represents the highest stage of a nation's development.
Interesting. So does that mean, like, my deep love for pizza is part of my national identity? I'm kidding, kinda. But seriously, it is interesting how all those things come together to shape a nation's, like, sense of self.
Yeah, but the author's point is it goes deeper than just shared traits.
Deeper how?
It's about this deep sense of unity, a shared purpose that goes beyond just liking the same food or whatever.
So it's more than just surface level stuff.
Exactly.
Now, this paper also dives into some pretty heavy philosophical stuff.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Anarchism, for one.
Okay.
What's their take on a world without states? Do they think it's even possible?
Well, they find the idea appealing.
I mean, who wouldn't want to be free from state control? Right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, they argue it's just not sustainable.
Why not?
Humans, they say, we kind of crave structure and leadership. Even in a world without states, some other structure would just pop up in its place.
So it's not that people are bad, just that we need some kind of organization.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
Interesting.
The author even talks about struggling with this idea themselves.
Oh.
There's this part where they describe imagining a society without laws against murder, and it really highlights that tension between personal morality and the need for some kind of societal order.
Yeah, I see that.
Now, the paper also takes a look at the state of Western nations today. What's their assessment? Are we headed in the right direction?
Well, they paint a bit of a bleak picture, to be honest.
Really? How so?
They argue that traditional national identity in the West,
Yeah.
things like shared history, culture, all that, they're being eroded by things like cosmopolitanism and consumerism.
So instead of focusing on what makes us unique, we're becoming more generic, globalized.
That's the idea, yeah. They think it's leading to a decline in shared purpose and unity.
That's unsettling. But how does this connect back to the whole state versus nation thing?
Well, they argue that as national identity weakens,
Yeah.
the state steps in to fill that void.
It becomes the new source of identity and authority.
Exactly. And in doing so, it gains even more power.
So instead of serving the nation, the state becomes more self-serving.
Right. It draws power from the masses instead of a distinct national identity.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah. And this shift has some big implications for how the state operates.
Like what?
They argue that states are now prioritizing their own growth and self-preservation.
At the expense of the nation's well-being.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're starting to see how all these pieces fit together.
Right.
But things get even more controversial when the author brings immigration into the picture, don't they?
Definitely.
This is where they really start challenging conventional thinking.
Yeah, this is a sensitive topic for sure.
We got to be careful here to just present the author's views without,
Taking sides.
Exactly. So what's their take on immigration?
Their main point is that mass immigration, especially when it involves people from vastly different cultures, can actually speed up the erosion of national identity.
Okay. And how does this connect to the state's supposed power grab?
They argue that as traditional identity gets diluted through mass immigration,
Yeah.
the state steps in to fill that gap. It becomes the new source of unity and identity, further cementing its control.
It's like the state's taking advantage of this fragmentation to solidify its authority.
That's the argument, yeah.
Yeah.
It's important to note they're not necessarily against all immigration.
Right.
They're mainly concerned with mass immigration that happens too quickly and without considering the impact on national identity.
So it's not about closing borders entirely, but being more thoughtful about how immigration impacts national identity and social cohesion.
That's a fair interpretation, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about eroding national identities and mass immigration.
Right.
Now let's bring in this other big idea the author keeps coming back to, globalism. How does that fit into their critique of the modern state?
They see globalism as this natural progression of the state's desire for self-preservation and expansion.
So it's like they're trading their allegiance to a nation for a spot on the global stage.
Yeah, kind of. They argue that globalism weakens national sovereignty and transfers power to these supranational entities.
Like the UN or the EU.
Exactly. And they're concerned about what this means for democracy and individual freedoms.
So it's not just about economic cooperation or international relations.
Right. It's about a fundamental shift in power.
And the implications that come with it.
Exactly.
There's this really striking line in the paper where they ask, does the American military exist to protect an American nation, or does it serve the interests of Washington?
Wow.
That question really gets to the heart of their argument, doesn't it?
It does. Remember, they see states as kind of transient.
Always trying to grab more power.
Exactly. Sometimes even from their own nations.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is. And it leads us to a really important distinction the author makes between states and nations.
I'm listening. Tell me more.
They argue that states are fleeting, but nations are eternal.
Eternal. Wow.
They endure because they're based on something deeper, something that goes beyond politics and material stuff.
Like shared history, culture.
Exactly.
Often a spiritual connection to a specific land and people.
You got it. They use the example of the German nation to illustrate this.
Oh, how so?
The German nation persisted through monarchies, National Socialism, democracies, even a communist republic.
So the state changed drastically, but the core of the German nation remained.
That's their point. And they see this inherent tension between these enduring nations and these fleeting states as key to understanding their relationship, especially when the state prioritizes its own interests above the nation's.
I remember them using a really powerful analogy to describe this tension.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
Something about states becoming like...
Occupying forces?
Yes. It really drives home the point that a state can become almost alien to the nation it governs.
They even connect it to their analysis of the Soviet Union.
Okay.
How the Soviet state saw the Russian nation as a threat.
Why a threat?
Because it represented this strong identity and unity that could challenge their authority.
Wow, so national identity is almost like a check on the power of the state.
That's a big part of their argument, yeah.
It's fascinating how they frame nationalism not as this inherently negative thing,
Right.
but as a potential safeguard against tyranny.
It really makes you rethink those assumptions, doesn't it?
It does. Well, we've covered a lot in this first part of our dive.
You have.
We went from basic definitions to uncovering this complex power struggle.
It's a lot to take in.
And the author has some strong opinions about where things are headed.
Definitely.
Stay tuned for part 2, everyone, where we'll delve even deeper into the author's critique of modern states.
Sounds good.
We'll also explore their views on immigration and globalism, which are sure to spark some debate.
Can't wait.
Welcome back to our deep dive, everyone.
It's great to be back.
We left off talking about this idea that modern states are getting kind of disconnected from the nations they're supposed to be serving.
Yeah, that's a key point in the author's argument for sure.
They paint a pretty stark picture, saying states often prioritize their own growth even if it hurts the nation's well-being.
Right, and they point to a bunch of trends to support that.
Things like eroding national identities, mass immigration that push towards globalism.
Exactly.
Okay, let's break those down one by one.
Sure.
You mentioned this erosion of traditional national identities. What exactly do they mean by that?
Well, they're talking about how in a lot of Western societies, the things that used to define national identity,
Like what?
shared history, culture, language, even religion,
Okay, yeah.
those are being deliberately weakened, sometimes even erased.
So instead of celebrating what makes a nation unique, we're shifting towards this more generic, globalized kind of belonging.
You got it. That's what they're suggesting.
And how does this happen?
They point to things like multicultural policies that put diversity over unity, or the promotion of cosmopolitanism.
The idea that we all belong to one big global community.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like a deliberate effort to dismantle traditional ideas about the nation?
That's their argument.
But why? What's the motive behind that?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
They believe that by weakening this shared identity, people become more dependent on the state for their sense of belonging.
Ah, it's a way for the state to consolidate its power.
You get it. More control over the population.
Okay, I see how that ties into their whole argument.
Right.
Now, let's talk about mass immigration.
Okay.
This one is obviously a really sensitive topic.
Yeah, for sure.
The author's views are going to be controversial, no doubt.
Absolutely. We need to be careful here and just lay out their arguments without taking sides.
Of course.
So their main point is that mass immigration, especially when it involves people from very different backgrounds, can make that erosion of national identity happen even faster.
And how does that feed into the state's supposed power grab?
They argue that when a nation's traditional identity gets diluted through mass immigration, the state steps in to fill that void.
It becomes the new source of unity and identity.
Exactly, and that just gives it more control.
So the state is capitalizing on this fragmentation to assert its authority.
That's their claim.
It's a bold one, for sure.
It is, but it's important to remember they're not saying all immigration is bad.
Right.
Their concern is mainly with this mass immigration that happens super fast, without really considering the impact on national identity.
So not closing borders entirely, but managing things in a way that keeps the nation's unique character intact.
Yeah, a more measured approach.
Makes sense?
They believe that's essential for finding that balance between diversity and unity.
Okay, so we've talked about eroding national identities and mass immigration.
Right.
Let's move on to that third trend, the push towards globalism.
Okay.
How does this fit into their critique of the modern state?
They see globalism as kind of an extension of the state's natural desire to survive and expand.
So instead of being accountable to a specific nation, the state joins this bigger global network.
That's the idea.
And the author's pretty worried about that.
They are.
They think as states get more intertwined with global institutions, they become less responsive to their own citizens.
Right. It's like they're trading their loyalty to the nation for a spot at the global table.
And what does that mean for the people?
They argue it often comes at the expense of individual liberty and democratic values.
So globalism isn't just about economic stuff or international cooperation.
No.
It's about a fundamental shift in power.
And the consequences that come with that.
They're urging us to look beyond the positive spin and really consider the downsides.
Absolutely, especially for the balance of power between states, nations, and individuals.
This is all pretty heavy stuff, not gonna lie.
Yeah, it is.
But does the author offer any solutions?
They do.
Or are we just doomed to watch states get more powerful and more detached from the people?
They're not entirely pessimistic, actually.
Oh, good.
They have some ideas about how individuals can push back and reclaim some power.
Okay, tell me more. What do they suggest?
One of the big ones is resisting this erosion of national identity.
How do we do that?
They want people to reconnect with their nation's history, culture, tradition.
To celebrate what makes their nation unique.
Exactly. Rediscover what's worth preserving.
But how do you do that in a world where saying you're proud of your nation is often met with, like, suspicion?
It's a good point.
It's like the word nationalism has become a bad word.
They address that directly.
Okay.
They say we need to reclaim the true meaning of nationalism.
What do they consider the true meaning?
For them, it's not about exclusion or thinking your nation is better than others.
So what is it about?
It's about love for your nation and wanting to preserve its culture and heritage.
Okay.
Recognizing the importance of shared identity and purpose, but without putting down other nations or cultures.
So it's about finding that balance between celebrating your own nation and respecting the diversity of the world.
Exactly. They believe a healthy sense of national pride can actually promote tolerance and understanding between nations.
it's not nationalism itself that's dangerous, it's how it gets twisted and used by those in power.
Right. That's when it becomes a problem.
So they're pushing for a more nuanced, enlightened kind of nationalism.
Yeah, one that's about cultural preservation and mutual respect.
And they think that's key to pushing back against the homogenizing forces of globalization in the state.
Absolutely.
Okay, so rediscovering and celebrating national identity is one way individuals can make a difference.
Right.
What else do they suggest?
They also talk about active citizenship and community engagement.
What does that look like practically?
Getting involved in local politics, supporting local businesses and organizations, working with your neighbors on shared issues, all of that.
So building strong communities from the ground up.
Exactly. They see strong communities as a counterforce to the growing power of the state and the isolating effects of globalization.
Finding belonging and purpose in our immediate surroundings instead of just relying on these big, distant institutions.
You got it.
And one last thing they emphasize is being critical consumers of information.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Questioning those dominant narratives we hear all the time.
Especially the ones that justify expanding state power and eroding national sovereignty.
So thinking for ourselves, challenging assumptions, not just blindly believing everything we're told.
Exactly.
They think that's how we create a more informed and engaged citizenry.
One that's harder to manipulate and better at holding those in power accountable.
This is all so insightful, even though they're raising some serious concerns.
Right.
They seem optimistic about our ability to make a difference.
Oh, yeah, they definitely believe in individual agency.
We have a choice. We can passively accept the way things are going, or we can actively fight for a future that aligns with our values.
It's a powerful message.
We're not helpless in the face of these global trends.
Definitely not.
It all comes back to that core tension between the state's hunger for power and the strength of national identity.
The author keeps coming back to that, yeah.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, do they have any predictions about where this tension is headed?
They don't claim to have all the answers,
Fair enough.
but they do say the future depends on the choices we make, both individually and as communities.
So it's not all set in stone.
No.
We have a role to play in shaping how this relationship between states and nations evolves.
That's the big takeaway for me.
It's a call to action, a reminder that we're not powerless.
I agree.
All right, welcome back, everyone, for the final part of our deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We've been exploring this complex relationship between states and nations.
Lots to unpack there.
We've talked about those basic definitions, uncovered this potential power struggle.
Right.
And now I'm curious, what does the author think the future holds for all this?
Well, they believe this tension between states and nations, it's only going to get stronger in the years to come.
Oh, that's not encouraging.
They predict states will keep grabbing more power, often at the expense of national sovereignty and individual freedoms.
So is there any hope? Or are we just headed for, like, a dystopian future?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom.
Okay, good.
Remember, they also gave us some practical advice on how we can push back, reclaim some of that agency.
Right. Those strategies for individuals.
Exactly.
Remind me, what were some of their big suggestions?
One of the most important ones is actively resisting the erosion of national identity.
Okay.
They want people to reconnect with their nation's history, culture, traditions.
To remember what makes their nation special, worth preserving.
Exactly.
But that's tricky, isn't it?
What do you mean?
Well, nowadays, saying you're proud of your nation, it can almost feel taboo.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's like nationalism has become this dirty word.
The author addresses that directly.
They do.
Yeah, they say reclaiming the true meaning of nationalism is essential for fighting these trends.
Okay, so what do they consider the true meaning?
For them, true nationalism isn't about excluding people or thinking your nation is better than everyone else's.
So it's not about that superiority complex.
No, not at all.
Then what is it about?
It's about love for your nation, a genuine desire to see its unique culture and heritage thrive.
Okay.
It's recognizing the importance of that shared identity, that common purpose.
But not at the expense of other cultures, right?
Exactly. It's not about putting other nations down.
So it's finding that balance?
Yes.
Celebrating your own nation while still respecting the diversity that's out there?
They actually think a healthy national pride can lead to more tolerance and understanding between nations.
That's interesting. It kind of flips the script on how we usually view nationalism.
It does. It challenges that assumption that nationalism automatically equals conflict.
Right. The author's saying it's not nationalism itself that's the problem.
It's how it gets twisted and abused by those in power.
That's when things go wrong.
Exactly.
So they're advocating for this more thoughtful, responsible form of nationalism.
One that recognizes the value of national identity, but also embraces diversity.
And they see that as key to pushing back against globalization and the overreach of the state.
Exactly.
Okay, so remembering and celebrating national identity, that's one way we can make a difference.
Right.
What other strategies did they talk about?
Active citizenship and community engagement were big ones.
What does that look like in practice?
Think about getting involved in your local community, supporting local businesses,
Okay.
working with your neighbors to solve problems that affect you all.
So building those strong local connections.
Exactly. They see strong communities as a buffer against the state and the isolating effects of globalization.
Finding that sense of belonging closer to home.
Yeah, instead of relying on these massive impersonal institutions.
Makes sense.
And lastly, they encourage people to be critical consumers of information.
To question everything.
Well, maybe not everything, but to definitely question those dominant narratives that get thrown around.
Especially the ones that try to justify more state power and less national sovereignty.
Exactly. They want us to think for ourselves.
Not just accept everything we're told by those in authority.
Right. They believe that's how we build a more informed, engaged citizenry.
One that's harder to manipulate and better at holding leaders accountable.
That's the goal.
It's inspiring, even though the author brings up some serious issues.
I agree.
They still believe in our power to make a difference.
Oh, yeah. They're definitely not saying we should just give up.
They're saying we have a choice. We can either go with the flow or actively shape a future that aligns with our values.
That's a powerful message.
It is. It reminds us that we're not just cogs in this machine. We have agency.
We do.
And it all comes back to that central tension we've been discussing, the state's desire for power versus the enduring strength of national identity.
That's the thread that runs through the whole paper.
So, any final thoughts from the author about where this tension is headed?
Well, they don't pretend to know exactly what the future holds, of course.
Of course not.
But they do say it all comes down to the choices we make as individuals and as communities.
So it's not predetermined. We actually have a say in how this unfolds.
That's what I took away from it. It's a call to action.
A reminder that we're not powerless.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation.
I agree.
It's really gotten me thinking about the forces shaping our world and what role we each play in all of this.
You too.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive thought-provoking as well.
We hope it sparked some curiosity.
Maybe even inspired you to think a little differently about the relationship between states and nations.
Yeah, and to question those assumptions we often take for granted.
Exactly, because the future of this dynamic, it's not set in stone.
It's up to all of us to shape it.
So, keep learning, keep questioning, keep the conversation going.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.